Very good. Okay, welcome all to session 3 of Getting Started with Online Course Development. At this point, we are on to the section that we're calling Being a Tour Guide. So your students have reached their getaway destination, but now they need someone to walk them through all of the sites there are to see. So just as a quick reminder, there is a companion course for this workshop, and you should all have access to your personal courses as sandboxes to play in. The companion course is the online course development training, and the personal one should be course development training with your last name, and they're both located under the No Term tab. As we mentioned before, this is sort of a prototype course, so we do expect to be adding on to things as time goes by. Also, I do apologize, I'm just overcoming a little bug, so if I start coughing over in a corner, just ignore me for a second. So just a quick review, we're continuing to follow our backwards design approach. And this third session will focus on providing instruction within Brightspace, though many of these concepts are broadly applicable. This will include concepts tied to providing high-quality instruction that engages students and prepares them to successfully complete course assessments. And we'll also be looking at some types of instruction and some specific instructional techniques. As before, we're going to go and start with our outcomes, and today we're looking at creating relevant course materials. Now, to start with, I'd just like you to consider your role as an instructor. Now, the most important thing to realize in an online course is that you're no longer the so-called sage on the stage, where everything is pushed out from you. Instead, we tend to think of it more as being the guide on the side. And the exact nature of your role as this guide will change a little bit depending on the course content and the specific activities that we'll do. But generally, I like to break it down into acting as the expert. So you're still the one that's providing the direct knowledge component of the course. But you also have the role of providing feedback. And because of the more limited face-to-face encounters, the feedback that you provide on assessments can become much more of a teaching tool. Sometimes you may find yourself as a facilitator if you're using student discussions, and especially if you're getting involved in that discussions. And last, you may find yourself to be the collaborator, which I think is actually the most fun, where you get to provide ideas to students on where they go next, or what they can do to improve, or best of all, what they can do to follow up on their interests. But really what you're seeing here is, as the guide on the side, everything is connected to your role as the instructor across the entire course. So the next question is, what should I be covering as the instructor? Well, this is just some general questions to think about. At the highest level, what enabling knowledge, so basically, what do students need to know in order to perform and get to your final outcomes? Sorry, I'm going to try to change my view a little bit because I can't see half my slides. And following that, what activities, in this case, we're talking about learning activities, which is what we broadly refer to as activities that push knowledge. Which of these activities will equip students with the knowledge and the skills that they need? Now, the next point might seem a little bit duplicatory in terms of saying, well, what will need to be taught or coached, but this is really a differentiator. It's look at it as, well, what knowledge should be prerequisite, what knowledge should come from supporting sources, and then by elimination, what knowledge needs to come from you as the instructor, and also what knowledge has the highest value when it comes from you as the instructor, even if there are other sources for that knowledge. And finally, number 4, what materials or resources are best suited to support you in the first 3. So now that we've talked sort of about, well, what do I want to teach? What are some characteristics of quality instruction? Well, there's a lot of them, like really, really a lot of examples, far more than we can possibly cover in one 40-minute session. But what I want to point out at the highest level is that any instructional practices or theories that you're using should always be research validated. So everything that we do as IEDs is backed up by research. So now I do want to go ahead and define a few characteristics in a few different ways. So to start with is just some items that are definitions to be familiar with. So really, each of these could easily be their own 4-day session if you were really to dive into it. Even on the companion course, we're really just going to scratch the surface on these. But these are just terms that are around a lot in education right now, so you should be familiar with the concepts behind them. The first of these is differentiated instruction, and this involves basically the idea of teaching to each individual student. And in some ways, this is where fully online courses can truly shine, because you can do an individual learning path for every student that allows them to go back and reinforce knowledge that they're weak on and go look at knowledge that they're interested in more depth. However, that can take a lot of work. So a very simple version of this is as basic as, here's my explanation as the instructor. Here's a second explanation in case you didn't understand my explanation. And here's a third source that will take you more in depth into this topic if you are interested on it. Or a slight variation of that is, here's a third source that covers a tangential subject or topic that you may find interesting. The next one is universal design, or as you'll often hear it shortened, UDL. This one's actually really interesting to me because it is not a concept that is limited to education. It applies to everything in life. But for our purposes, what we're looking for is a course which is usable by the most people with the least amount of intervention. Finally, we go on to cultural responsiveness. And this one has a lot of definitions, but this one is probably one of the easier ones to understand, which is simply, it's a pedagogical approach that connects students' cultures, languages, and life experiences with what they are learning in school. And this can be done in a lot of different ways, but one of the most basic that's come out is simply using examples that reflect on students. And that can be something as simple as a picture in a PowerPoint that reflects your ethnicity, or something as complex as a project that delves into your personal cultural background. The other term that I want you to be familiar with is the idea of educational equity. And What that means is simply that we're making sure that every student has access to the resources and educational rigor they need at the right moment in their education. And that things like race, gender, ethnicity, and some of the big ones for us, language, ability, and family background or family income, and of course, sexual orientation, none of that should matter. So we need to build courses and materials that are robust enough or individualized enough that none of this matters. So again, those were just some very general, high-level definitions that you should be familiar with. But now we're going to move on to stuff that we want to dive into a little bit more. So the first thing I want to talk about is that quality education should be engaging. And hopefully I'm being at least somewhat engaging, but I could certainly do any number of things if I had more time that would make this more engaging. So don't take this as a perfect example. But at its base, this is really a simple idea that if I, as a student, am interested in something, then I'm going to pay more attention to it. I'm going to focus on it more, and I'm going to be more willing to engage in critical thinking. And one way of trying to make material more engaging is to take materials and make them student-centered. And this really increases the opportunities for student engagement when the student feels like the materials are connected to them. Now, a couple ways in which you can try to drive this engagement. First of all, is just subject interest. Beyond the core of what you need to get across, why is your subject interesting? If you have the option between two articles that both get the same point across, which one is going to be more interesting to your students? And a good way to judge that is what's interesting to you as the instructor. Basically, the more passion and interest you show in your subject, the more students by association are going to feel interested in the subject that you're teaching. Obviously, there are limits to this, but still, remember why you got into this career. Remember why you hopefully still enjoy this field of study, and pass that interest on to your students. Now, the third point that I'll look at is the idea of student involvement and self-determination. And this is simply that when a student feels that they have some say in their education or some choices that they can make, that determination, self-determination, can increase their buy-in to their own learning and thus their engagement. Now, you can get really, really in-depth with student involvement and self-determination. There are examples out there of faculty that basically work with their students throughout the entire semester to build the course from the ground up. But probably a really basic example of this is simply allowing students to choose a topic for a research paper. Broadly speaking, I'm going to pick something that I'm interested in as a student, and then I'm going to be more invested in finding out more about that topic. I'll be more engaged with that topic, and hopefully I will end up providing a better artifact related to that topic. So again, as with a lot of this stuff, you can go very, very in-depth, or you can start very basic and go from there. Now, the next one I'd like to look at is the idea of relevancy. Now, this is very closely tied to engagement because generally, if students feel something is relevant to them, they're going to be more engaged with it. Now, in education specifically, what this is referring to is learning experiences that are either directly applicable to personal aspirations. So what, as a student, are my future goals? Interests. Hey, this is my personal interest. I'm going to pay attention to this. Or cultural experiences of students, which in this case really means, is the material personally relevant to the student? Or last, topics that are connected in some way to real world issues, so current events, problems, and contexts, or as they refer to it, life relevancy. So the first thing I'd encourage you to think about is the relevancy to you as an instructor. Again, you are the subject matter expert with the most knowledge of this topic. So why are these topics that you're teaching to students relevant to you? So essentially, you're drawing a personal connection between this is what I went through, and this is why these topics will be important to you. Sort of tied to that is the idea of industry relevancy. So not necessarily tied to your own skills and experiences, but within the industry, this is why these topics will be interesting to you or of use to you. Student relevance is a really great one because it's an opportunity to bring in student experiences. And now this is also probably the most limited of them, because depending on what you're teaching, sometimes students won't have relevant experiences. But if you can make this connection, well, what it comes down to is we all like to talk about ourselves. So if you can give students that opportunity to talk about themselves, it becomes more relevant to them and they will be more engaged. On the flip side, current or historical relevance is probably the easiest. Time is always marching forward, so you can always find something that is happening right now that is related to the subject that you are teaching. I honestly cannot think of a subject where that is not the case. And even better, you've got all of history to go back and pull examples from. So just for example, I, at one point in my life, was an engineer, and I could go back and look at all sorts of disasters and do case studies on those to better understand the material science failures and the risk analysis failures. So again, all of history to draw from. There's got to be something there that is relevant to your subject matter. So now this one's a bit interesting. One of the characteristics of high quality instruction is that it is taught by highly qualified instructors. So what you really need to understand and honestly believe about yourself is, as the instructor, you add value to this course. Without you, this course would not be as good. If it was taught by somebody else, this course would not be as good. So as the instructor, you add value to a course. And within that, we can ask sort of the question of, well, what value do I want to add? So what is your contribution to your students' success? There's a lot of examples I could give on this, but I really personally believe that your personal experience and your personal passion on subject matter can be the most valuable thing that you can bring into the classroom. Because again, if we think about engagement, you being passionate about this material will help make your students more passionate about this material. Now, one thing that is also closely related to being a highly qualified teacher is having a well-developed instructor voice. So this is, to very much simplify it, basically how do students know that you are in the course? And I think the first part of this is just setting expectations with your students and yourself about what interaction in the course looks like. But that has to do more with communication and assessment. In terms of actually delivering information, the key is really customization and personalization. So the most common example that we use in this is don't use straight textbook slides. We all have textbooks. Most of those textbooks come with slides. A lot of faculty will just throw the slides up as an extra resource. But that is really a lost opportunity because it is very easy to take those slides and customize them. And you can do something as easy as throwing some notes onto them so that they have the textbook slide and then your thoughts. Or it can be as high-end as going through and customizing them completely for yourself. Now, this is the one time in the entire presentation I'm going to mention AI, because what I did for this presentation is I used a lot of AI-generated images. And the reason that I did that, or at least a big part, is that it allowed me to customize the people being shown in those images to bring in more diversity. So going back to some of the concepts I mentioned earlier, if you were to look back at my slides, I think there's a good variation in female versus male and a lot of different cultural backgrounds represented. And had I just gone and searched images on Google, chances are I would have ended up with a bunch of old white guys for most of those images. So again, customization and personalization. Own the course. So another thing I wanted to touch on was the idea of quality over quantity. So this goes back a little bit to our first day where we were talking about creating objectives and the idea of ranking the importance of your objectives. When we're providing information for our students, it really is easy to provide an overwhelming amount of information. So we need to try and focus on what is critical in relationship to our primary materials. Again, the thing that's great about teaching fully online is you do have the opportunity to let your students go down various rabbit holes if they want. But you really need to focus on keeping your primary materials well focused, sorry. Doubling up on myself. So we go back to the same questions. What is critical? What is important but not critical? And what is nice to know? And one way of doing this, coming again from Fink in 2013, is that it's identifying the heart of the issue as designing a content-centered course versus a learner-centered course. A content-centered course is basically what we all grew up with. We were students, and we've probably even taught them this way. Basically, we're starting with a list of topics, often based on textbook chapters, and we work through them over the semester, focusing on coverage. Alternatively, a learning-centered course begins with the answer to the question, what can and should students learn in relation to this subject? And then moving forward to organize our activities, assessments, and content presentation in a way that supports that learning. So again, we're kind of going full circle with our backwards design model in that when we're thinking about delivering information, what is critical, what is important but not critical, and what is nice to know, and making sure that it's clear to our students which materials fall under which of those banners. So next, I just kind of want to run really quickly through some of the modalities and types of instruction that we use. This part is probably going to be running at pretty high speed. So to start with, one of the most common ways that we offer information in an online course is what we would consider a mini lecture. Now, exactly what constitutes mini, we will talk about in a few minutes. But within this, you have the idea of a written mini lecture and or a video mini lecture. Now, with the written mini lectures, they're often faster to create, and it's easier for you to embed links in here for students to go down those various rabbit holes. And there's a lot of ways to enhance this from the very basic version I have here, either with something as basic as adding in images and diagrams, or something more complex like using some of the options from the Creator Plus suite in Brightspace. And if you don't know about that, Kathy Dutton did do a presentation on that earlier in the week, so that should be up on the CELT website at some point. On the flip side, you have the video lectures. These are often considered more engaging, and they certainly have a bigger instructor presence because you're literally on there as the instructor. And you can do some fun things with video lectures, like incorporating live demonstrations, if that makes sense in the context of your instruction. I also want to give a shout out that we do have a light board at Oswego, which is a really cool tool. And if you have any interest in using that, again, help@oswego.edu, say, I want to use the light board, and we'll follow up with you. Now, the downside of the videos is they do require subtitles. And you can use auto subtitling to start, but you need to walk through those auto-generated subtitles and add in punctuation, make sure that the terms are right. This can really get into an issue if they're scientific terms. Sometimes it just has no idea what you're trying to say. So you have to plan time to walk through your own presentation after you've made it in order to make sure the subtitles are accurate. And this, then just as a very general statement, just be aware of your background and surroundings. Make sure that there's nothing behind you that you don't want somebody to see. Be aware of background noises. They can be extremely distracting and disruptive. So again, just be aware of where you're doing the recording for your mini lecture. Sort of parallel to this is the idea of the annotated PowerPoint. Now, most often this comes from an instructor PowerPoint provided, a publisher PowerPoint that's provided to you. But this really jumps right into what I was saying earlier, in that these are really easy to customize simply by putting notes in the bottom and letting students that know that they're there. You also have more advanced options like voice annotation, but be aware if you do that, you do need to go back and have subtitles or a script for that. I'm actually not quite sure how that works for PowerPoints now that I think about it. Carrie may have some insight on that in the chat, in terms of whether or not you can just do a script for it, or if you have to have some sort of subtitles for audio annotation. Anyway, sorry for that aside. But again, this is very simple to do. And it also gives you access to a lot of the same tools that you would have in a standard text editor, in terms of you can insert pictures and links into your notes to further enhance whatever your comments on the main slide are. Reading materials. Again, as I said earlier, you really want to have primary resources that are focused and relevant to the course objectives, but it's perfectly fine to have secondary or optional materials that are broader. And of course, our main spot is a textbook. I always like to remind people that there are a lot of OER options out there, which can really make life easier for the financials of our students. We have journals and trade magazines, academic research papers, blogs and newspapers, and of course, publisher slides. We've talked about them several times, but they do have their place. A little bit more fun is the idea of student-generated materials. And these are just a few examples of those. One of the most basic is you simply ask students to locate materials for use and share them in something like a discussion board in Brightspace. And the nice part about that is, depending on the settings, you can sort of vet those resources before you release posts to the rest of the class. If you're a little bit more adventurous, you can have your students create questions for discussions or quizzes. For some reason, students really seem to like this one, and every now and then they'll come up with really mean questions for their peers. Peer review is certainly a method of asking students to generate materials. And last, another example is creating papers for publishing. So basically telling students that I'm going to have you create something and it's going to be released into the wild. As soon as it becomes something that's going to be consumed by the broader public versus just you as the faculty member or their fellow students, a lot of students suddenly seem to worry a lot more about the quality that they're putting out there. Again, these are just some examples of student-generated materials. Then there's just a wealth of other external resources that you can put into the course. Penfield Library has just a massive number of resources, so I would encourage you strongly to talk to your subject matter librarian. Even if you don't have anything in mind, just come in and say, hey, I teach chemistry. What kind of resources do you have laying around? And find out what they have, because they've got a lot. YouTube and similar video sharing sites are, of course, the gift that never stops giving. Just be a little aware of what you're using in terms of potential stuff that's not public domain. There's a lot of professional repositories out there. And one neat thing that you can do maybe more easily in an online course than a different type of course is bring in other other subject matter experts. So if you know somebody in the field that's either famous or simply has some relevant stories to share, it's really not that big a deal to ask them to do a short video for you. Or maybe you even want to go further than that and have a Zoom session with them, and any students that can attend can ask questions, but then you record that Zoom session, share it out to the rest of the class. And then in terms of equity, I would also recommend that you give students the opportunity to email questions to that faculty or to that other subject matter expert, preferably through you. Just to see, just so everybody has the opportunity to ask questions, even if they couldn't make it to the live session. Now, what we talked about a lot just now was sort of modes of instruction, different ways that you can push knowledge. But there's also a bunch of different methodologies for instruction. And I've listed a few here. And the website that I'm listing breaks down these and a bunch of others and gives examples. So again, that will be on the companion website, and it's worth taking a look at. But looking at these activities, I think they're all fairly self-explanatory. So what I want you to think about is which of these are instructor-centered, i.e. being pushed from you, and which ones are student-centered, where students are generating the information themselves. And remember that things that are student-centered are generally going to be more engaging and more relevant to the students. But I'd also like you to think which of these really benefit from having instruction offered prior to the assessment, and which of these benefit from having instruction offered after the assessment. So just some things to consider as you're thinking about the methodologies that you want to use for instruction. So now what I want to move on to is a specific practice. And this is one of the most common ones that we use, which is chunking. There's literally been decades of resource on content chunking, and it's basically established these principles. That learners have a limited attention span. I don't think that surprises any of us. But some of the other ones are a bit more interesting. So learning is really facilitated by teaching from the really basic, moving into the more complex. So basically you build on known knowledge, which is where prerequisite knowledge comes in, and you work towards the information that you want students to learn that they don't already know. Now, what's kind of interesting to me is that over time and with more experience, learners get better at this. So they can handle larger and more complex chunks. So what this means for your course, or even more specifically for an individual concept, is you start very simple. But by the end, you can move into larger and more complex perspectives on the subject. And last is just a neat little tidbit, which is that learning in chunks is assisted with retrieval activities. So basically, you have an excuse for all those mastery tests and stuff that we talked about last time, because those are retrieval activities, and it's very easy to pair retrieval activities with chunked learning. Now, in terms of the size of the chunk, scientific research on brains and learning really has not yet determined the ideal size of a content chunk, or a really hard set of guidelines on how best to break a lesson into meaningful chunks. So one of your roles as faculty is to use your expertise to guide you in how you want to chunk content so that your learners can acquire the knowledge and skills in manageable bites. But keep your videos short. Some sources say lecture videos for classes should be no longer than 6 minutes. Some say no longer than 15 minutes. In practice, the precise length should depend on the complexity of the topic and what you want students to be able to do with the information. But if you're looking for a broad recommendation, I would say keep them around 10 minutes. And then last, I'll let you in on a little secret, and I unfortunately don't recall where I heard this, but if you're looking at a course, 9 5-minute videos is going to feel like a lot more value than one 45-minute video. That's just how our minds work. So now, with that out of the way, what do I consider when I want to chunk? So first of all, I want to consider prior knowledge. So I need to analyze what people already know about the topic, what they might misunderstand about the topic, and what knowledge they are missing. And that really lets you chunk according to their instructional needs. For example, if they have more prior knowledge, we can use larger chunks. If they have less prior knowledge, we should use smaller chunks. If they have misunderstandings or missing knowledge, we should include chunks that are specifically focused on fixing those misunderstandings or on filling in that missing knowledge. Again, returning to chunk size, people who cannot use prior knowledge to help them process what they're learning when they're new to a topic are going to need smaller chunks. This helps them reduce potential overload. But then, as we noted, when people have more knowledge, we can meet their needs with larger chunks that offer targeted information for their specific needs and interests. In terms of sequencing, the sequence of chunks should be logical for the information offered and needs to meet the instructional needs of the audience. So for people new to a topic, we often need to offer foundational information before more complex information. Chunk organization, we really want to make sure our chunks are organized with clear headings and subheadings, and this sort of ties back into sequencing. Basically, we want to help people see how the content is organized, and levels of heading and subheading can help people literally see the hierarchy of the hierarchy of topics and how they relate to each other. Time for a drink break. All right. Let's see if we can do a little better. You can also add in content overviews like content charts, content maps, course outlines to reinforce these content structures. And then last, we have the idea of chunk activities. And this goes back to what I was saying about retrieval, that to help people really deeply process this content, we want to ask questions and provide relevant feedback, relevant practice, and remembering activities. Again, we want to make sure that people have had the opportunity to fill in any missing knowledge, get answers to questions, get clarification if they need it, and fix any misunderstandings. And when we get to the higher level of sort of implementing chunking, we really want to make sure that all of the opportunities to do those things are built in. So we sort of touched on this a little bit with sequencing, but one really important thing is also the idea of visual chunking, or as you might have heard it, good use of white space. And so these are the same set of knowledge, and I know it's too small for anybody to actually see, but it doesn't say anything anyways. But even without being able to read it, which of these seems easier to process for you? The one that has all of the text in a big block, or the one that breaks it up into logical sequences? So just something to consider if you're using that type of a text-based mini lecture, or just as you're presenting information in general. So the next activity that I want to touch on is scaffolding assignments. I am going to make this one really quick. This one is kind of a blend of instruction and assessment. The term itself was coined by Jerome Bruner, but it's based heavily on zone of proximal development by Vygotsky. The idea is that you should always create lessons that are challenging but achievable for students, and that your role as the instructor is to provide the support or scaffolding until the student can complete the task without help. So basically, this is a teaching method that provides temporary support for learners as they develop new skills, and then that assistance is gradually removed as students become more competent, ultimately leading to their independence. And one of the most basic examples of this would simply be that you begin by modeling the information, then walking students through guided practice, like by doing problems with them, and finally leaving the students to do independent practice. So again, a very basic example, but it gives you an idea of what it looks like. So going back to our little worksheet that we've been touching on throughout this, we're finally in our last column, which is knowledge delivery. So hopefully you've got your learning objectives, you've figured out your artifacts, you know how you want to assess all of that, and now it's just looking backward and saying, okay, how am I going to accomplish all of that based on how I deliver my knowledge? So that wraps up session 3. I know that was a tremendous amount of information, but I invite anybody to ask any questions. All right. Well, with that, I hope to see you all tomorrow for the final session. Thank you all for your time.
Thank you, Doug.